Sure, everyone can hear
We're
you.
live.
Oh my God. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I was about to ask a question and okay.
Oh,
Hi.
wow. Hi. Yeah, I can just see I switched over to the chat and I can see all the people now. Hello, everyone.
Oh, how did you do that? Oh wow.
Okay, so there's comments. Go to the comments one.
Oh, okay. There. Oh, gee. Hello, everyone. Oh, I see people from LA. Shout out LA. Hey,
Mm-hmm.
Buffalo. Lots of people from all around the world. Thank you guys for joining us.
First stream, so excited. Yeah, thanks. Glad you could be here. Welcome.
So we're here to talk about BDSM. And I
Mm-hmm.
think it's going to be a fun conversation because it's, in my experience, very different based on where you guys are. And I'm seeing a handful of people in LA. I'm from LA, if you couldn't tell. And yeah, I believe you're in Portland, yes, or am I wrong about that?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay,
Yeah, I'm in Portland and then I previously lived in Seattle, so I'm familiar with both of those areas.
nice. Did you want it? We're supposed to start off with a story. Did you want to go first?
Sure, yeah. So people who don't know me, I'm Evie Lupine. I'm a kink educator for 6 years now, 7 years, something in that general range. I've been in the scene for just a little bit over that, like probably almost coming up on 8 years here in the next couple months. And like I said, I lived in Seattle, lived in Portland, and I got into the scene at the time when there were definitely not resources like this, and there were not like YouTube channels or dating apps, even like were very difficult for talking about kink on. They had to be very sneaky about it because otherwise you get somebody who would like report you for being too explicit, or they'd assume you were advertising something you weren't. And yeah, I'm just excited to talk about kink and help answer some questions and just yeah. In terms of a story about me, I guess I will say that my first foray into kink, just for people that are new and are like, I feel awkward about being here, is I got into kink because I was trying to explore. I had just graduated college and I was experimenting with new things, and I ended up coming across something called pet play, and I was like, oh, what's that about? That's something I'd enjoy. So I researched it. I went on all kinds of websites and I ended up discovering it that way. Eventually I was able to find a local dungeon to go to, and I went to that, and it was a lot of fun. And ever since then I've been doing kinky stuff. So sometimes it really just takes being brave that first time of like going to an event, going to a party, and it might not always be the case that you'll run into the right people and then you'll be able to like connect. But if you keep going, eventually you're going to find your group of people and you can have a good time. But yeah.
Awesome. I had a similar trajectory. I was in a very normative vanilla relationship for 6 years.
Mm-hmm.
And I definitely I knew that I was kinky, but I also like had this sort of, I'd accepted that my partner wasn't, and that like I was a monogamous person, and that, kink was just a thing I couldn't do. And also, frankly, my introduction to kink was very abusive and very terrible.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I met my partner, I was trying not to acknowledge that. But of course, after 6 years, you kind of realize, like, all right, this is part of me. And so when I eventually left that relationship, I started going out. I was in Orange County at the time, and I went to a very, very small dungeon that's no longer in existence, but it was really, really, really nice. And I remember going in and being like, like like what do people like, what do you guys get out of this, because I was intrigued, but I didn't quite get it. And it's funny because I remember specifically, like, why do people like getting spanked? Like, that's such, like, why, and it actually took me diving in a bit more to really understand just how much I would enjoy BDSM. And
Mm-hmm.
when I eventually moved to Los Angeles, there's way more dungeons. And I try to travel a lot, and I'm learning that in LA, we are spoiled. We've got, 3 major dungeons. I feel like there's always a new space opening up. And, it's definitely we've got a lot going on, and there's a lot of
Mm-hmm.
good, bad, and ugly. And when I first came into the LA scene, I, of course, connected with some people who are not great, which is very common, especially if you're an S type and you're new in the community. And, you know, there's people that, you know, they pounce or whatever. And so I've sort of shifted my BDSM, my position in the BDSM community right now, in that I tend to sit a bit more on the side of an organizer. I run a fairly large BDSM social in the city. And it's kind of all about just meeting people and connecting with people. And I'm very invested in it because I don't want people to run into the same things that I ran into.
Mhm.
And so I'm really excited to have this conversation because there are so many really terrible things that happen to a lot of people when they're dipping their toes into BDSM.
Mhm.
And I think it's one of those situations where sometimes you don't know any better. And
Mhm.
you know, one of the best resources that anyone entering into the community can have are other people who've already done it, who kind of already know what to look for in terms of like red flags and such. So we are here to talk generally about BDSM. We're here to answer your guys' questions. I tend to speak about BDSM from more of a person who does it kind of perspective, more of a personal perspective, and Evie definitely takes on way more of the like, let's really break down these educational points. So I think it's really
Mhm.
great that we were able to join up again with Field and have this conversation. So we should start. Should we dive into some? Oh, there's not very many questions, but we just got one.
Yeah.
Leave your questions in the chat. And we will just be going through them over the next hour, I believe, and answering them as we can.
Yeah, and definitely there's no stupid questions. Nothing is too basic or too simple. This is a completely open floor for like if you're like, well, I don't even know what BDSM stands for, all the way over to like more advanced stuff. You guys want to get into that? We're totally open, or at least I'm totally open. So whatever level of questions we get.
Yeah.
hmm so the first one, there we go. Are there any reputable online blogs or kink education classes beginners should look into? My partner and I Google everything, but how do we know what to consider with so much out there? So
Mm.
there's definitely blogs. I can't like I'm sure like I mostly find like kind of archived old like live journal pages, like not really things that are currently being updated. But it is really hard to know when you're new, like, am I getting the right information? Is this just somebody who's making something up entirely and it's not what most people think or most people do? I really like for rope bondage, my go-to recommendation is Shibari Study, which is a really great online resource for all levels of different types of bondage. And that's like the main one that I normally go to, but it really depends on what you're looking for in terms of like power exchange, rope, impact play, like any of that. It can vary so much.
Yeah, you know, I don't have the best answer for this because I am definitely a hands-on person who has just gone to a lot of classes. And I feel like I know like the standard names to give, but I actually haven't checked out their work enough to know if it's good. I know a lot of people like a woman named Midori who does like a lot of great like rope education
hmm
stuff. Um, I am also a person who I'm a rope bottom. So you know, I just get tied up in it. You know, I know very little about the actual happenings of the things. I mean, I know some is probably much as I should to speak with authority. But a lot of people I know really, um really like Midori. I
Mhm.
believe that it's international, but I might be wrong about this actually. But one of my partners is in a group called Devil Mask Society, which is a pretty serious rope tying group that I believe has cells all over the country.
Mhm.
And I think I might be wrong about this. I think if you look into it, you may be able to find some online stuff through them, but I'm not
Mhm.
totally sure. But if not that, local classes. Definitely, I would say when you're first getting into it, there are a lot of online classes that people teach. There are a lot of people who are just teaching classes online. And I know that that might seem boring, you know, I know that like taking classes, you just want to jump into it and do it, but there's a lot of really, really great classes online that you can check out that are definitely worth listening to. So I would just say in general, don't be afraid to seek out classes and listen to classes.
Yeah.
Because I've known a lot of people who feel like, well, I can just do it or whatever. But, you know, the people who have done it before, you know, are usually, though not always, aware of what they're doing. And BDSM is one of those things where we can try to make it safer, but it's never probably fully safe. But there are safer ways to do it, and classes are the ways that you find out those ways.
Yeah, definitely in-person classes, I think, are, especially if you want to do any sort of more physical techniques like tying somebody up or spanking them, in person is going to be really, really good for that. I also want to echo, I think Midori is a great educator, and I think they're, if you look, it's just literally Midori, like the, like Midori, like the color green in Japanese, like it's, yeah. She's great. I know she's teaching a class very soon on, like, I think rope handling. I also really like Lee Harrington. They also very regularly teach classes online. And then if you can look for BDSM conventions, a lot of them will also have an online section to them where you can basically remotely audit classes that are being taught in person, but you can watch them like from wherever you are in the world, which is great. But I think maybe let's move on to the next question, which is from Shannon. Any advice for someone going to their first munch? I've seen online some people guard their privacy by using fake names. Didn't even think that was something I needed to be worried about. And I imagine you have a lot of thoughts about this, Kat.
Well, you know, I do, but I also don't, because when I went to my first munch, I was like, hi, my name is Catherine. Right. But also, you know what? I, because of my job, could not really go to a munch and just have someone like not know who I am, you know?
Yeah.
I will sometimes use a different name, but it's still technically my name. Like the name that I'll often use is Rin, which is still my name. It's the last 3 letters of my name, RYN. But the thing to keep in mind about this is that, you know, a lot of what we're doing is not going to be understood by the vanilla world. And there are a lot of people, unfortunately, who have, you know, situations where if it was known that they were participating in BDSM, there are certain things that would become more complicated. So for example, I have seen, even within my community, I've seen this a few times. I've seen couples, right, go through a divorce. And then when they are, you know, trying to get custody over a kid, someone will bring up, well, you know, she goes to the dungeon on the weekend, right? And so as much as I'm eager and like, you know, encouraging everybody to like, you know, look into it, explore it, whatever, if you can, definitely be wary of the fact that there are some people, even within the community, who can be vindictive and may try to use your participation in BDSM against you. So err on the side of caution. Don't be me. Don't be, you know, having a fake name is a-okay. There are people that I've known for years whose like real names I'm only just learning. And frankly, I think most people are going to be understanding of that. You know, but when it comes to a munch, just in general advice going to your first munch, I would say go just dressed comfortably in something that you feel good in. I would go with very low expectations. A munch, for those of you guys who don't know, is a BDSM meetup in a non-BDSM space. So I mentioned earlier that I run a munch in Los Angeles, and it's just a bunch of us hanging out at a restaurant/bar, having conversations. And half the time we're not even talking about BDSM. Most of the time people are talking about Doctor Who and all types of nerdy things, you know? So it's a very much non-sexual, non-kink sort of space. So just look at it like you're going to meet a group of people for friends. It's nerve-wracking, but you know, going with an open mind and understanding that, you know, everyone's here probably for the same reason you are. And you know, just, you know, you will meet a lot of good friends, lots of great people at BDSM munches. So it is the number one thing I will tell everybody to check out when they are first trying to step into BDSM.
Yeah. And then I would want to add on to that just to make it clear for people that using a fake name is usually called a scene name, which
Yes.
is like a name you pick. And there's different ways of going about it. Some people will have it where that's the name they use when they just go to a munch, but then as soon as you like get to the part of, exchanging phone numbers or something, they go, oh, well, my name's actually whatever. Or some people do like what Kat was saying, like they use the same name in all kink contacts with all kinky people for years and years. And then you find out when you're like booking a hotel room together that, oh, your legal name's actually this. And like, usually it's not really that big of a deal, is for privacy, but also there's like mental separation between like
Yeah.
everyday work life where you're Bob, but then when you're in the kink space, you're Phoenix or something. And so it helps you have that separation. And that can also be helpful for playing and just like, having a distinct headspace for the stuff that you're engaging in.
Yeah.
But
As a person who doesn't have a lot of separation between my BDSM
mhm.
self and my vanilla, not vanilla. I don't have a vanilla. I'm not vanilla. I don't have a vanilla side.
Yeah.
My like outside of the BDSM versus in, like I feel absolutely nothing about telling people my full and actual name. So yeah.
Yeah. Okay, maybe let's move on to the next question. So John says, how would I convince my partner to try kink? And I'm going to slightly take issue with the phrasing of this because I think it indicates maybe the mentality behind it. I
Mhm.
think you can't convince someone to be kinky. You can suggest to them exploring kink. Like you can say, hey, is this something you'd like to try and do? And I think it's a really common thing that people run into where they're in a vanilla relationship and they want to try kink and they're like, wait, how do I make this happen? And I think if the mentality you go into it with is I'm trying to make this person do this thing for me, like you're not going to have success doing that, or it's going to be like you're not going to be able to hear no basically, and it's not really good. So I would think about it more like I want to introduce this potentially into my relationship, and how do I do that in a better way? And I think I always try to think about it in terms of it's an additive thing for your relationship. I think people tend to become very like, especially when it's really like close to your heart and you've been wanting this for a long time. You're like, I need this. I have to have it. I can't be happy without it. And if you go into a conversation like that, it's going to freak your partner out probably. So I recommend kind of introducing it more like, hey, there's this cool thing I've been reading about. I think it could be fun to do together. What do you think about this? And have it be a very open conversation where it's not like the super high pressure, if you can't do this, we're going to have to break up kind of a thing. Like just introduce it as a fun, casual thing, explore it together with them, have lots of space for questions from them. And then also be open about like, hey, like, what are you curious about? Because especially if you haven't had like a super sexually open relationship to this point, by which I mean not like open to other people, I mean like communicating about it openly. If you haven't been able to be open with your partner about other areas of your life, sexually or otherwise, it might be harder to have this conversation. But also, that means that maybe your partner has things that they want to do that you don't know about yet. So it can also be a mutual experience as well. But at the end of the day, some people are vanilla, some people are kinky, and you cannot make a vanilla person kinky. And to try to do so will usually end up damaging the people involved, IMO.
Yeah. Yeah. I would say that that's a pretty good answer. So I don't have much to add on to that, but I've definitely been in a situation where, I mean, I was in the relationship I mentioned, where I was kinky and wanted to talk about things with him and was really, really nervous about it. So I didn't really. And then through circumstances, he figured out a lot of things, and it was kind of heartbreaking because it
Mm,
was one of those things where I understood he very solidly like wasn't, not only was he not okay with it, but he was actually pretty judgmental about it. And I
mm,
think that when you think about, even discussing this with your partner, you should probably measure, how important is this to you? Is it important enough for you to potentially risk it being the end of your relationship? And for some people, the answer to that is going to be yes. And some people, the answer to that's going to be no. For me, I
mhm,
realized that a lot of BDSM and a lot of my draw to BDSM relates to things that, printed onto my sexuality really early on that probably were not the most healthy, but are nonetheless part of me. And I
mhm,
needed to be with a person who I felt I could be fully open with. And so even though it was hard, I did leave that relationship. And now I'm polyamorous. I have 4 partners. not all of my partners are kinky, and some of my partners aren't into the things that I'm into, but they know all the things I'm into, right? And being with people who understand that, respect that, even if it's not their thing, was really, really huge, because my ex literally said to me, you know, part of being in a relationship sometimes is making sacrifices, and therefore you might just have to like not do this thing you want to do. And as much as I understood where he's coming from, especially from a monogamous perspective, I understood that this was part of my sexuality, and part of loving me and embracing me is embracing that, even if you don't participate. And so, yeah, I'm very happy that I left that relationship, because I've gone on to have very amazing situations that have, you know, really tickled that part of me. And you know, and there's some stuff that I was really into early on that I don't even have, you know, don't even do anymore. Right. But the fact that I was able to explore was very important to me. And it was, even though it's a hard decision, it was the best decision for me to realize that I needed to disconnect and move forward. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Sometimes the best thing to do is to not hold on to something that's not working for you anymore.
Yeah.
So yeah, maybe let's move on to the next one, which I think is sort of interesting. What are some firsthand red flags that differentiate BDSM from bullying? Which I feel like is a very interesting. I'm not like fully sure how to interpret what this question means. I don't know if you have any thoughts, Kat.
I mean, I do, but you know, look, as I said, I tend to speak from my perspective and experience, and I definitely, when I came into the BDSM community, experienced something that could be seen as bullying, in retrospect. So I guess we do have, but you know, I'm just connecting the dots. I don't know if this is what the person's actually asking, but you know, for me, what was really common in, you know, for me early on was, I would say that I was a submissive. And then there would be somebody who would say, well, if you were really a submissive, you would da, 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 da. Like I remember this one time, this guy was like, if you were really a submissive, you would show up to our first meeting wearing no panties. And I knew I didn't want to do that. I knew I didn't want to do that. And I knew that that wasn't my kink. I knew that I didn't enjoy that. I knew it made me uncomfortable. But he said, if you were really a submissive, you would da 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 da. And that's constructed to make you feel like, you know, you need to do this thing. You need to do this in order to really be who you say you are. And it is manipulation. And unfortunately, you know, you're going to meet a lot of people like that. And it's sometimes hard to really get away from that. And, you know, even though I'm speaking from a sub perspective, it does happen on the other end as well. I can't speak to that, but I want to make it clear that that does also happen. But I think that that has a lot more to do with pressuring and, you know, coercing, which unfortunately, even though we definitely see BDSM as consent forward and all about negotiation. And, you know, there are unfortunately some people who try to hide some of their more abusive things behind BDSM. And the kind of person who says, if you're really submissive, you would do da 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 da, insert thing you don't want to do and you know you don't want to do. Those people are a bit more on the abusive side. So that's my connection to that. To that.
Yeah.
But yeah, BDSM is about negotiation and consent. It should be there should be a conversation. If you're doing something that you don't maybe fully want to do, you doing it should be because I'm excited about, you know, pushing myself to that, you know, not because you don't actually want to do it, but because you enjoy the challenge. Being coerced, being pressured, for me, that's not BDSM, that's abuse. So
yeah, I think that's a really great example of like I've had that exact same story more or less of somebody being like, hey, newbie sub, this is what you're supposed to do to be a true submissive. And like it's exhausting, and it's never true. Like you get to make it what you want it to be. And if that means not ever wearing panties, great. But you can't just assume that for just going to a random event that's going to be the default for all submissives.
yeah.
But the next question is, any advice for oh wait, I think we're gonna move on to another one. What would you have to say to someone who has had bad experiences with people utilizing BDSM terminology improperly / for their own gain? Met some people like this who view BDSM through that personal lens. I guess my assumption with this question is You mean people that like say they're a dom on like a dating app or something and they're not really, because they're trying to
Wow.
use it as a way to like get you to send nude photos or something. It's like my classic example of that.
Mm.
I'm gonna answer this on the basis I think that's what you mean. But if it's not, then well, I guess we answered a different question that could have also come up instead. Um, I would say if you're running into people like that, that's obviously not representative of most people in the BDSM scene. I wouldn't even say people that do that are necessarily kinky per se. They are cynically using something that's is meant to be very personal as a way to like try to get to something typically. And it's really unfortunate that happens, but it's not the majority of experiences. And just like if you run into people that are making you uncomfortable or that are trying to manipulate you, like you don't owe anyone anything, you can block, move on, not continue to have the conversation, and just don't engage is usually what I do if I run into people that I feel like are trying to be manipulative or are having underlying motivations they're not necessarily being direct about.
Yeah, and I also think, even though I think we like to believe that a lot of this stuff is like standardized, and in a way it is, there are also people who just have a different philosophy. And sometimes for me, part of getting to know somebody is like understanding what they mean when they say that they're
Mhm.
dumb, understanding what they mean when they say that they're a switch or whatever, because
Mhm.
sometimes people can have their own personal philosophy that doesn't at all align with you, and that's fine. I've been told by so many men that I'm not as submissive because I don't want to immediately submit to them. And
Mhm.
I've learned and when you're younger or you're fresher, you're wet behind the ears, in the scene, you might think, oh, that's like normal, or that's what that actually is. But with time I've learned, no, actually there are people who their philosophy is aligned with you. So sometimes it's really about just like asking what people actually mean about those terms. But there are
Mhm.
unfortunately a lot of people, especially online, who misuse those terms.
Mhm.
And when they say dom, they don't mean in a BDSM context. They mean that they like being dominant sexually, which is fine and totally valid, but just not the same thing that I'm talking about. So yeah.
Yeah.
Though I do
Yeah.
enjoy that as well, but it's not the same thing.
Yeah, two different things, related but not the same.
Exactly.
So the next question is, I know that many people ask questions from a newbie perspective, but what are some missteps or things that you have seen from very experienced people, be it blind spots, missteps, mistakes, etc.? I think the thing for me that always comes to mind with this for like very experienced people is in terms of missteps, maybe is like they get very set in their ways. Like, this is the way I learned how to do this thing, so it must be the only way to do it. And then they're very resistant to learning new techniques or information. And it's a very like sort of like, the kids these days and all their newfangled ideas about this, so it's totally unnecessary. And I think I sort of have a similar approach to kink as I do with like developing like a personal moral philosophy, which is I'm always getting new information. I'm always reevaluating. I want to learn new things. I want to be able to change. And I think if you're like, it's one thing to know what your identity is and be like, I'm sure I'm a submissive or I'm sure I'm a dominant. I'm meaning more in terms of like just keeping an open mind generally. And I think that's a lot better long term for people. And it's a blind spot that a lot of people have. And I think especially when you get really into the community and you get very embedded in it, I think it can be difficult to like recognize certain like more negative patterns we have in the scene and kind of just treat them as normal, like the overvaluing of callers or the overvaluing of certain types of play. And kind of, I think a lot of people end up in this position where they kind of don't even realize they're going through the motions of like, this is what doing kink is supposed to be. And they've really lost touch with what was originally that spark that drove them towards kink in the first place. And they're just doing, well, a flogging is done this way, bondage is done this way, and they've lost sight of what is actually fulfilling for them. And I think if you can stay in touch with that and stay introspective, it really helps your journey longer term. But great question. So you have anything to add, Kat?
Um, you know, Kind of, though this is a bit of, it's a similar strain, but slightly different direction.
Mm-hmm.
Big thing that I've seen in this scene in terms of experienced people is, you know, and I feel like this is everywhere, but I know this is a very particularly LA thing as well. I think Portland is also like, oh, I definitely know it's like this. There's like a segment of the community who was in the BDSM community like in the 80s and the 90s, and they're very stuck in that sort
Oh,
of thing. And then you've got like newer people, especially post pandemic, who want to participate in the BDSM world, but are alienated, frankly, by how overtly white, heterosexual, and cissexist a lot of BDSM is, a lot of BDSM spaces are. And so you've got these people who want to be part of a more inclusive, accepting group of people. And then you've got the older people who say, well, we were always accepting of those people. Like, why do we need to change anything that we've been doing? Right. Like, their perspective is, I knew 2 or 3 marginalized minorities who came to the BDSM club. Why are you trying to reform things so that it's more inclusive? Why do we, for example, have events where there are no cis men allowed? Right. Like, and
a travesty.
And I've had these arguments with people, where, they think that because they knew a couple of marginalized minorities that used to tolerate the more, cis, heterosexist sort of spaces, that there's no issue. But what they don't understand is that there are so many people who come to a BDSM dungeon and they only see that, and they don't come back, right? Like,
yeah.
The munch that I run in LA is deliberately like a inclusive munch. It is like, look, I'm a Black trans woman. I'm organizing it like, that, and that's forward in my organizing, right? Which means that I actually get quite a few diverse people, right? People who I don't actually see at other events. We recently I just go to this one, but there's a Black munch in LA, which is a new thing. And there were people who were arguing, like, why do you guys have to have a Black munch? Like, why, because on the description of the event, it was like, look, this is an event for Black people, right? And there are people who just, because of their own whatever, have such a hard time understanding why that's important. And there's unfortunately been quite a few conflicts with that. And so I would say that's my biggest thing with more experienced people, is sometimes they don't really see that the way that they've been organizing has not actually been as inclusive as they might think it's been. And so they see any sort of movement of inclusion as an insult, which is silly, but it is what it is. Fortunately, I think in LA especially, the inclusive events are definitely the more popular events. So, we probably won't deal with that for much longer, I think.
Yeah, exactly. I think there's a tendency for, and I know exactly the people you're talking about in the Portland scene. They're like, back in my day when I was president of this and it was in 1989. And I'm like, okay, great. Good for you. Like there is sort of an issue of like color blindness sometimes, of like that being the core philosophy is like, well, aren't we supposed to not judge people based on their race? And then suddenly it becomes a problem when somebody wants to have a BIPOC munch or like whatever. And that's definitely a big issue. But I think something that kind of ties into this is the next question, which is, what is body positivity like in the BDSM community? Being a small, fat, 5'9" woman weighing circa 200 pounds, will I be considered undesirable? And this is something that, like, I am not like a larger body person, so I don't have personal experience with that. I can say what I have observed across all the different scenes I've been a part of. I've, like, outside of California, I've gone basically the whole West Coast from like north to south, and everywhere that I've gone, there's always a huge amount of diversity in terms of body type, body size, age. I think the images you get from like kinky models or photo shoots, like if you Google BDSM and you look at the black and white photo of a guy wearing a suit and a tie and then a woman in black lingerie, like you're going to get a very particular idea of BDSM is this. But in actual reality, in my experience, it's been a very diverse community of like many different types of people and different body types. That doesn't mean that judgment doesn't happen. I think especially with certain segments within the BDSM community, it's better or worse. Like I would say rope bondage and the bondage scene has the most ongoing issues with like active discrimination and fat phobia. But then the rest of the scene, I think it really depends on what groups you're a part of and like where you go and who you're around. And you will find people that are like just terrible and people that are amazing. But like you will see people who look like you is kind of the main point. Like you will see diversity, you will see people who are like you. And like you'll find people that are totally into that. It's one of the things I really like about kink is that in terms of like body positivity and nudeness, like you get used to seeing like all different types of nude bodies, and it's typically treated in a pretty neutral way outside of maybe particular people that are like only submissives that are size 0 get to do this event, and it's like that's not really a thing that happens. But
yeah, I'm going to echo a lot of that, because I would say, so I'm the sort of person who goes to events because I like to just be naked. I don't do shit. I just like being naked. And I would say that the BDSM events that I've gone to since I've been in the city have definitely been great for my body positivity, because they've just encouraged, like when I first started going out, I wasn't a person who dressed very like risque, really. I remember the first event I went to, I actually went out and bought a bunch of like sexy clothes, because believe it or not, I used to dress quite modestly. But the spaces that I've been in with BDSM have been so great at encouraging people to just come however the fuck they are. I'm not thin, haven't been thin since I was a baby, so I definitely know that what it feels like to be a larger person and discriminated against in a lot of other spaces, but I haven't felt that overwhelmingly in the BDSM community. I would say the larger, more general BDSM community, you are 100% going to see quite a few larger bodied folk. But when it comes to rope, and this is my still ongoing thing, rope people can be very fat phobic. I had a dom who is actually fairly well known in LA. Say when I told him I was a rope person, he said, "Oh, that must take a lot of rope," just an offhand comment. I'm sure he thought it was hilarious. I mean, and I wasn't like offended, but I knew from that point that he was like fat phobic, right? And bizarrely enough, he's a person that people would often say is very inclusive just because of the diversity of some of the people that he works with. The rope community is 100% going to be, of the places in BDSM, the most fat phobic. And so I would go into it with that in mind. And with that in mind, there are places, especially woman-owned rope events, especially because honestly, I don't want to hark on this point too much, but the problem for the most part in the BDSM community is men. Men who have their own like weird things about what kind of people they want around them. Because there are events where you got to send in a photo in order to get accepted, sort of thing.
Yeah.
Those sort of events are usually catered to selling to men. But there are quite a few like women-owned, women-run rope spaces that I know of that are pretty great, and those are 100% going to be the places where you're going to see larger bodied people. They also tend to be very sapphic places, so if you're specifically looking for that, those are also great for that. But yeah, rope is going to be one of those places. I'm definitely in like a place where I like to do rope, and it's hard for me to find people to do rope with. So I'm going to start doing self ties, even though I don't have an interest in topping, because it is very fat phobic. So that's like the only place I will say it is overtly fat phobic in the BDSM.
Yeah. Yeah. And I will just, as a final note on that, I will say, like, you will hear people who will defend that, saying like, oh, well, it's dangerous to suspend people that are such a size. And it's like, that's not true. It just takes different skill, and like you can do it if you want to learn how to do it. It's not any more difficult than any other kind of rope. And like I have seen people that are 300 pounds be suspended. I have seen people in wheelchairs be suspended. I have seen people with all sorts of different things going on with their bodies, and people that have had amputations be suspended. It's like any kind of body can be suspended. It's how much work they're willing to put in as the top to learn how to do it. And frankly, a lot of people do use rope as a way to get to sex. And so if they're not sexually attracted to you, they're like, oh, if I don't want to fuck you, I'm not going to tie you up. And like most other parts of BDSM are not quite as
like
sex forward.
Yeah. And it is kind of like a skill thing. I'll say, like, some people just don't have the skill. And frankly, some of the people that are the most well known in the city for rope are not actually very good at it. They know how to do a few things. And that's really what it is. They know how to do a few things on a very particular type of body. But rope, as an aside, as we talk a lot about it, I want to make this incredibly clear. Rope is incredibly dangerous. So, when if you're a bottom and you want to bottom for rope, understanding that the person you're doing it with knows what they're doing is very important. You can have injuries for life if someone ties you up the wrong way. I've been fortunate in that my suspension experiences have all been with people that know what they're doing, but for the most part, there are some people out there that just, they know how to do a cool looking thing, but they don't actually know how to do it safely. So be careful.
Yeah, definitely be careful. Rope's very risky. And we already talked a little bit earlier on in this about like resources and places to go to find more information about that. And another Evie that's not me, Evie Vane, has a really good book that's called Better Bondage for Everybody. And it's specifically dealing with this topic. So if you like reading, definitely go check that out. But the next one I think is a great question, which is, could you explain what subspace is? I had a partner recently tell me I got her there, but I had no clue what that meant, and I was too embarrassed to ask in that moment. I'm very curious because I don't think I've heard you talk about this before, Kat. Can you explain what subspace is? Not to put you on the spot.
Okay, so there's an easy way that I'll explain it, but I don't know if it's the best way to explain it. Like, so the first time I experienced subspace or bottom space in this context, I didn't know that was what was going on because I hadn't experienced it. And for me personally, subspace, it feels like a drug, honestly. Like it's intoxicating and you feel very like loopy and suggestible, and it takes you a bit to come down from it. My first experience with bottom space was I went to a taste testing event, and there was this person that I had like a lot of chemistry with and had built it up over months, and we finally did a scene, and it was intended to be a taste test, but he took some liberties, and he just took me there. And it was one of those like sort of things where the moment I was done, I was just in a really great mood. I was smiling at everybody. And because he was like working the event, obviously he couldn't tend to me, which is the bad thing. Because of course someone else was like, oh, do you want to play? And I was like, yeah, totally, whatever. And, and I did. And that's why aftercare is very important, frankly, because for me, at least, subspace is a very vulnerable place, and it's a place where I feel very open, and it feels like a drug, which is why some people like do this just to chase that experience and that feeling. It feels like you are just like very, very happy. And you've gone, it's almost like that feeling when you've done like a really, really hard workout and you've been able to relax for a bit and you're proud of yourself. Because for me, at least, a lot of times when I have done a scene, I'm proud of myself that I've like made it through. Sometimes that's kind of what the entertaining thing is. And then I'm sitting there with, my little spots that are a little stingy or whatever. And it takes me a bit to come down. So that's kind of the best way I think I can describe it. It makes me feel loopy. It does feel like I'm on some sort of drug, but I wasn't really. So that's kind of like the cool part about it, for me at least.
Yeah. So I think that's a great example of it. Like when I've gone into subspace before, which is not like a default experience of like most people doing BDSM. You don't have to experience this for it to be like a good or proper scene or anything.
Yeah.
Like it's definitely been very floaty, detached. Sometimes it's very like giggly for me, like especially for pain. I get very like giggly and loopy. Yeah, that suggestibility, that pliability, like just blissed out, I guess is the way I would describe it. And it, like in terms of what it means, it typically means that your partner is like having a good time, getting into a good headspace. They're really relaxed and enjoying what is happening. Not all the time. Like there are some people that are like really extreme masochists where they can have somebody like hit them and do a scene with them and they won't enjoy it and they'll kind of get into subspace like despite what they consciously want in their brain. But for most people, subspace is a good indication of like the scene was enjoyable, it was good, and they're in like an altered state of consciousness essentially that's brought on to BDSM. I usually compare it to things like a runner's high maybe, or an adrenaline rush from some kind of intense activity, or the mind space you can get into if you like do really, really long meditation for a long period of time. It can also be like that. It really depends person to person what it is. But if your partner has gone into subspace, I think the key thing is to have a conversation with her about, and I know you're too embarrassed in the moment to ask, but like, even if you're not saying, I don't know what subspace is, you can ask, hey, like I heard last time we had a scene, you went into subspace. I'd love to hear more about what that was like for you. Do you want to do it again? What do you think brought you there? And like just get more information about what subspace was like individually for them. And then if you want to explore it more, you can. But the main thing is sort of like got brought up in Kat's example is like there is that suggestibility. You know, to be very careful when you start getting into that territory, because once you're in that headspace, you have to be careful they're not going to like say yes to something that they're going to regret later. And that can be a common occurrence for newer people, is they don't realize it's happening to them. It happens and they go, why the heck did I then say yes to this thing with this person? I totally didn't want that at all. And then, you know, you end up in potentially bad scenarios that way.
Yeah, I won't tell the whole story, but I definitely, my first subspace experience ended up in some bad scenarios. Went to a whole other dungeon, went to a party after that, like a whole thing, like all bad decisions that I probably would not have made if I were monitored and if I got aftercare and if I was just able to like sit there for a bit. So I would also ask her, like, what do you need from me when you're in this space? Because like I said, aftercare is really important, and some people don't really acknowledge that as much as they should. And I've definitely been in a situation where like I'm in subspace, but then I don't have any aftercare, and it kind of like sours the experience sometimes, depending on the headspace that I'm in. So yes, definitely ask her what she needs as well.
Yeah, exactly. Always ask questions. If you're in doubt about something a partner is experiencing or they want, just ask them. And I get that it's embarrassing, but hopefully if you're doing BDSM, like you understand that like having a very open communicative relationship, even when that's hard to do and it feels embarrassing, like you're at minimum shooting yourself in the foot to not be able to get to what would be really good for both of you, or you're going to miss some really important information that like your partner is wishing they could tell you, but because you haven't asked yet, they don't feel comfortable bringing it up yet. But I'm moving on to the next question here because somehow we only have like 10 minutes left, so we're gonna like rapid fire this one. I think it's going to be, how do you find BDSM community / events in your area? I'm in Portland, Oregon.
Great place
I'm going to, I don't normally name specific events because like, I don't want people to like show up somewhere trying to find me at a party. So I will say, if you're looking for community events and things in your area, the way that I found stuff when I moved down to Portland is it sounds silly, but it actually works, is I literally just Google BDSM event Portland, or like wherever you're at, BDSM event, the New Mexico or Phoenix or whatever. And you'll be able to find events that way. However, the next step after you find events is figuring out if it's the kind of event you want to go to, which I feel like you can always find events, but the more important question is it a safe place to go? Is it the kind of event space you want to go to? And without naming names, I will say that the vast majority of spaces in Portland, with the exception of one I can think of, are all owned by swingers and primarily are swingers events. And I personally am not a swinger, and I don't really feel comfortable with the way consent is typically done in those spaces, so I don't go to them. But figure out where your comfort level is at in terms of like like sex and touching and all of that. And then at a lot of these events, there will be a newbie night or a social event. I recommend going to those first. And then, I recommend personally not drinking or only having like one drink or what would be light for you for drinking, just so you can stay like fully aware of everything. Really just observe who's there, how they're interacting, what is the front of house staff like, how clean is the space, like just get a good lay of the land first. And then later, if you decide I feel comfortable here, then you get into play. I think if you go into an event thinking I need to play here, I'm going to play, you might end up doing some things in a space you're not fully comfortable with and then not having a good time.
Yeah. Yeah. And also, if you can, go to a munch with a friend. Just because like I run a munch, and I would definitely tell people you can come to my munch by yourself. But at the same time, there are also munches that are just like some dude trying to like meet people, so you don't always know what you're walking into. So if you can go with a friend, go with a friend.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So the next one we have here is how to deal with a clique of people on the local scene who I feel give vibes like they aren't letting me enter their group, and I can feel this isn't happening with other new people trying to join them, question mark, question mark. So looks like you had a thought there, Kat.
So yeah, I haven't thought about this, and I'll try to keep it brief, because I've definitely had people come to my munch and say, it's cliquey, and it's like, it's really not. I get that it seems that way, because the thing to understand about a munch is that, for a lot of us, it is like we're seeing people we haven't seen in a really long time, right? So, and this might be the only time we see them. So we'll end up having these conversations with each other, and it might seem like we're not including you, but it's a munch, right? I'm not going to say that there aren't people who definitely don't want you to join in their group. That exists, I guess. But for the most part, if it's a munch, if the point is socializing, they're going to be very open to, you joining in conversation. Like when I'm at a munch that's not mine, I literally just insert myself into conversations. Now, I will say it's probably a bit different. For men, that's the impression that I have. I've never really had an issue with just inserting myself into random conversations. But, keep in mind that most people are there to meet people. Most people are there with the intention of connecting with people. There are some people that are especially there to help, bring new people in. Like one thing I do at my munch is I talk to everybody, and I try to figure out like, okay, this person wants that person wants that. And I try to like, hey, this person does this, and I think a good host will try to do that. So maybe sometimes what you're perceiving is just the host isn't great, or the event isn't for you. But for the most part, BDSM munches are about meeting people, and that's why people are there. So.
Yeah, exactly. Like I think I've had experiences at munches before where a group felt like pretty closed off. And I try to keep in mind sometimes it's like they're very used to new people coming in once and then never coming back again. So the advice I normally give to people is like definitely go probably 2 or 3 times before you make a final call and like this group seems clicky. Because sometimes you just like if you're there at a munch because you want to see your 4 closest friends you haven't seen in a couple weeks, and you primarily want to do that, and you don't want necessarily to spill your whole life story and talk about this intimate detail of a scene you just did with somebody who might like never come back ever again. So I think demonstrating that you're committed to like entering into BDSM will help with that. But yeah, you can always also message the event organizers too and like let them know like, hey, I'm new. I don't know if you know that I've been trying to like find a place to enter into a conversation. Hopefully they'll kind of like have that as a flag to look out for the next time you go along.
Yeah, definitely go back a couple of more times. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So the next question is, because now we talked about Portland, of course, we got to talk about LA. What are some safe-ish places for an aspiring sub in LA?
Okay, if I were to tell you one place to go right now in Los Angeles, 910 WeHo is, I guess it's no longer the newest dungeon, but it's one of the newer dungeons. It's a dungeon in West Hollywood. And of the places that I know of, they are the most committed to education. My friend Erin is now the lead director of education there, which I'm very happy for her. She runs an event called Arrivals, which is, I believe, an entry-level class kind of thing. You go there, she goes through, you know, the whole situation or whatever, just kind of gives you a rough sort of understanding. And then I believe the following day there's an event called entrance, which is your standard taste testing. You know, there's different people at different booths, try this thing out kind of situation. It's not, you're not going to go there for a full BDSM scene, but you know, if you're curious, for example, about electro, there's going to be people demonstrating electro, and maybe you can get like a little bit of it, you know. But 910 WeHo, of the places that I would feel confident saying are safe and are good to check out, I would say that's up there, number one on the list for me. So yeah, 910 WeHo.
Yeah, I Googled it because I wanted to see what it looked like, and like that looks like a great space. They've got newbie events coming up in July, it looks like too. So yeah, it looks great.
It is, of the places in LA, the one that feels the most kind of like a community center. It's not as dark and gothy as other spaces are. And they are also very connected with, you know, inclusivity. And, you know, I've thrown a bunch of events there. We raised a lot of money for the Los Angeles Gay and Lesbian Center. They're very good with that. So I would 100% suggest 910 WeHo.
Yeah. Okay, great. I think we probably have time for maybe one or two more questions. So this next one says, do you think it's better to be upfront with your kinks or slowly bring it up in a relationship? My opinion on this is, if you're getting into a new relationship and you know that you need to have kink in your life and you really want to explore it, be upfront with it.
Yeah.
Now, if you're already in a relationship, then of course you kind of have to slowly bring it up. I don't really think that piecemealing it is a good idea, because you will run into people that like they want a vanilla monogamous relationship, and even if you slowly bring it up, they will kind of feel tricked, like you presented you were vanilla but then you really wanted this other thing, and it might not actually be that you were trying to be sneaky about it. You were trying to just, you know, ease somebody into the idea. But I think it's always better to look for people who know that they want to have kink in their life and go with them, as opposed to going, oh, I can probably talk to this person 4 months into a relationship and then bring in kink. Like, well, you could have potentially wasted 4 months of yours and somebody else's time, which I don't think is necessarily a good thing to do if what you know you want is kink and the other person, you don't know if they want it or not.
Yeah. And I would also, I mean, this is just I'll give you a quick thing so you can latch onto it. Like, I think sometimes you have to ask yourself, why is it that you are trying to keep this to yourself and not share it with your partner? Is it because you're trying to control the outcome of it, or because it's not that important to you? You know, sometimes withholding some of that stuff is just an attempt to try to control things.
Yeah.
And that doesn't often set a great foundation for a good, healthy relationship with communication. Nobody dates me without knowing that I'm kinky. It's part of who I am. It's part of what I do. It's a huge part of my social life. It's a huge part of the work that I do offline. So everybody knows about it. Not all of my partners are involved. A lot of them are very alienated by the things that I do with other people, but they all know about it. And I prefer that honesty, especially after being in a 6-year relationship with someone where I felt like I couldn't talk about it at all. So that's my quick little thought.
Yeah. Okay, great. I feel like we got it all in there at exactly on time. So I am going to be doing a Q&A after this on the Field app. There's a group you can join. I think there should be a link to it in the chat if you want to join that. I'll be there for an extra hour just answering more questions in detail. And if you want, you know, some follow-up to things we already answered or just additional questions, like, feel free to be on there. And yeah, thank you all so much for being here and listening to us ramble about BDSM for an hour. This is great.
Yeah, thank you guys for joining us. And I really appreciate that you guys were open enough to ask us some really great questions. And I hope that it was all helpful for you guys.
Yeah, good luck in all of y'all's journeys and futures in kink. And yeah. Okay, yes, goodbye.